Dvorak was part of this kind of concerted effort to try to help American composers find this quote unquote American voice in composition. And this is another whole complicated topic, but it stems from concerns that the kind of artistic cognoscenti in America had about the lack of American produced high art products. And that included compositions, but it also included musicians.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer, and this is episode number 34. My guest for this episode is Joshua Gailey. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening and for your support. If you find value from the show and haven't already done so, please leave me a rating on iTunes. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you're really loving what you hear, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/Mark J. Connor. I'd also urge all of you to go to the Marching Roundtable podcast website and fill out their survey on electronic music. Now, on to the episode. Hi, Joshua.
Hi.
So thanks for joining me tonight.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And so you were introduced to me by a previous guest of mine, Michael O'Connor, came on the show and spoke about Civil War and Golden Age brass music. Mm-hmm. And he sent me an email recommending you as an expert in early band music.
Yeah, I really appreciated that. I listened to that interview and was excited to be able to kind of build on the work that he has done and that he talked to you about.
So can you tell the listeners what you're doing right now?
Yes, so I am right now a PhD candidate in historical musicology or music history at Yale University, and I'm working on a dissertation that kind of examines the roots of the public school wind band in the progressive era social reforms of the early 20th century. And then I'm kind of trying to chart the emergence of the public school wind band industry over those early decades.
Great. And so before we get into that, can you tell us about your musical background and what you do in music beyond the research?
Absolutely. So I grew up in Washington State, and I was raised actually by two public school music teachers. My dad was and still is a high school band director, and my mom teaches high school choir. So I was kind of just born right into the public school music scene and immersed in it from a very early age. I used to, tag along to marching band rehearsals as a very young child and whatnot. Learned piano when I was, 5 years old or something from my mom. Saw my dad playing the French horn and decided to pick up the trumpet, and really just fell head over heels for music very, very early on. So I decided to pursue music in college. I went to the University of Washington to study the trumpet. I studied there with Alan Vizzuti when he was still there. And then once he left, I studied with David Gordon, who's the principal trumpet player of the Seattle Symphony. But while I was in college and while I was pursuing the trumpet, I stumbled into an Italian studies degree. I started studying the Italian language mostly to satisfy the language proficiency requirement, but ended up enjoying those courses so much and enjoying the studies into Italian language, culture, and history that came along with it, that I ended up declaring an Italian studies major. And through my pursuit of kind of those two degrees, I ended up becoming interested in ways to combine them. And so I took some courses at the UW in Italian opera, for example, with Stephen Rumpf, who's one of the music history professors at the University of Washington. And that is what kind of bit me with the bug to study music history. I finished up at the university with a music history degree as well, and then went on to graduate school where I started by pursuing studies into Italian opera, but ended up realizing that there was a market out there to do some really rigorous study of band music and bands and how bands have kind of fit into American cultural history over the last 200 years or so.
Yeah, this is interesting because I have a composition degree, but I also have some theory degrees along the way as well. And I've been to SMT and AMS and the combined conferences over the years. And one of the things about musicology and theory is that band music tends to not get a whole lot of attention in those societies.
Right.
The band research tends to be in the music education communities.
Yeah.
And so this is really important, I think, that we do more of this work in like AMS, for example.
I agree with you 100%. And I think historically, those people with interest in the band, and there's certainly not a shortage of academically trained musicians who have history with the band, those of them with interest have been discouraged from pursuing band research as a primary research area because of that historical underrepresentation that you mentioned. And there's a whole host of reasons for that, from the kind of historical biases that musicology as a field has had against the study of what has been perceived to not be serious art music, as well as the kind of gaps between the disciplines of musicology, ethnomusicology, and music theory that the band just doesn't always quite fit into, because it's sometimes popular music, but it's sometimes art music, and it's sometimes amateur music, it's sometimes professional music. So it doesn't have the pedigree that something that's more culturally prestigious like the orchestra has, that made it attractive for musicologists.
Yeah, so let's talk about that bias. And now when you say biases, you're talking about all sorts of musics that's not the classical concert tradition. So that includes popular musics and jazz and the band tradition. And so can we talk a little bit more about that and where you think maybe that's headed now? Because I know it's changing. So
absolutely, it is changing, and it has been changing for a couple of decades now. And the changes are complicated. Like there are a lot of interest pushing the field in a lot of different directions, and it's really exciting to be part of a field that is changing so rapidly. But the short of it is that, as a little bit of historical background, musicology really grew out of 19th century German approaches to music criticism and studies of music history. So it has historically been a discipline that has privileged European music, and especially Austro-Germanic music, of the kind of high art tradition.
Yeah.
But in the 1980s, 1990s or so, musicology went through a really rapid phase of transition where the field started to open up to both new types of music to study, and then also different approaches to studying that music. And I think musicologists became more and more interested in looking at music as a product of culture, instead of just looking at it as art and trying to understand individual works as art. So the field has really diversified to include studies of popular music and non-Western music, to look at what we can learn about history and culture and different societies through both the music that they produce and the ways that they produce that music.
Let's talk about your research then. You want to just give sort of like the 20,000 foot view, and then we'll kind of dig in a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So the kind of zoomed out view is that I was interested in determining kind of what happened between what we refer to as the quote unquote golden age of bands, and then to what we see in the 20th century, where bands are such an integral part of public school music and public school music curricula, because there's kind of a gap there that there's been some research to address, but not a kind of unilateral look at what really happened. So my dissertation basically argues that as the band stopped being as popular as it was with band leaders like John Philip Sousa, and the kind of cultural landscape of the United States shifted in the early 20th century, there was a concerted effort to take the band and kind of institutionalize it, to standardize a lot of the elements of the band, including the literature, the instrumentation, and then to systematically teach it to children in order to help them learn better discipline, to become better American citizens, to try to improve their morals. It was part of a kind of political movement that was trying to use the wind band as a tool for social reforms. And then that kind of got glommed onto by a number of market interests like band instrument manufacturers or publishers to kind of build the school band, this new school band, into an industry and become self-sustaining as this kind of own autonomous thing.
Yeah, there's a lot. I have a lot of questions in here now that you bring up. So let's start with the golden age. Let's redefine what the golden age of the band is. Mm-hmm. And so we're talking about the 1870s and the 1880s?
Yeah, thereabouts. It's certainly not a hard and fast date range. But we're talking about a period in which the wind band was really one of the most popular forms of musical entertainment in the United States. And you have a whole host of really celebrity figures who were band leaders, who had their own bands, who would take them across the country and even across the world and perform popular music. And that popular music ranged from band arrangements of opera arias, which were really popular in the United States at the time. And there are actually some instances in which works from Wagner operas were premiered in the United States before they were ever premiered in the United States as band transcriptions, before they were ever premiered as operatic staged works. These kind of musical institutions are quite late in establishing themselves in the United States. Opera houses, symphony houses, and the opera companies and symphony orchestras that populated them really don't start being established until the late 19th century. And when they are, they're playing a lot of European cultural exports, a lot of German music, a lot of Italian music, a lot of French music.
So the bands were filling this void that classical concert music was not, or what we think of as the orchestra world.
Or at least it had a real central place of importance in American civil life. There's this image of the town band playing in the town square as a kind of unifying entity in the public sphere in American life. And that ranged from the professional bands that I just mentioned that would tour around the country and provide that kind of entertainment, all the way down to bands that were just formed by amateur musicians within their own town. We refer to them now as town bands that would just get together to make music on the weekends in the town square and really be a source of musical entertainment for their communities.
So why did bands lose popularity?
Oh, that's a very complicated question. But ultimately, it comes down to that tastes change. The styles of music that were popular changed, and American culture changed. So around the turn of the 20th century, you have the pretty rapid introduction of these new sound reproduction technologies like the radio, like the phonograph, that allow people to reproduce music in their own homes without having to learn a band instrument. So they have this new source of entertainment there. New forms of popular music start to really spread across the United States, starting with ragtime, followed by jazz. And I think both of those two things, the new popular musics and the sound reproduction technologies, utilize each other to spread even farther. So things just change very quickly, and the band falls out of favor, at least in terms of being the dominant form of popular music at the time. But what's interesting is that what I kind of want to argue in my dissertation is that the band never totally goes away. And even though ragtime gets very popular in the 1900s, Sousa's band, for example, is still touring the world in 1911. Sousa's band starts to record ragtime songs that allow them to kind of stay at the forefront of the popular music landscape. But this is where we start to see efforts at moving the band into the public education sphere. So as the kind of the professional bands start to lose the intense popularity they had, and the town band starts to wane in influence as sound reproduction technologies take over. This is happening at the same time in the United States as what we refer to as the progressive era, or the progressive reform movement, which was, generally speaking, a period in American history of concerted political reform, as well as attempts at social and educational reforms that kind of went along with that. And in the realm of music, you have a number of musical reform organizations that are attempting to increase the prevalence of and the access to music education programs across the country in an effort to one, kind of help the new influx of European immigrants to kind of assimilate into American culture, to kind of try to Americanize the youth of the United States, and then also to help improve their moral character, to try to help them become more disciplined. They had a very kind of concerted we're trying to do very specific things with music education. And in the early days, at least, in the around the turn of the century, that usually took the form of music appreciation. And there's this push to get what they referred to specifically as good music to be taught in the schools. And good music generally just referred to music that wasn't bad music. I mean, honestly, they really only define it in opposition to what good music wasn't, which generally tended to be ragtime and jazz. There was a very kind of racialized component to these pushes for good music, is that we want our kids to be learning art music and not this new popular music that is kind of creeping into the social sphere.
Well, I was going to say that the cynic in me has always believed that public education was developed to stock the new factories of the industrialized country.
I mean, yeah, and a lot of the progressive movement was a response to industrialization and to kind of reshape what childhood was in this time when industrialization is changing the landscape of the country. But at the same time, we have the institution of child labor laws that restricted the number of hours that children could work, and then new compulsory education laws that make students go to school. And so there's this push to kind of change what childhood meant. When children all of a sudden have all of this time, how do we fill that time? And for a lot of progressive reformers, the answer to that was music education, actually. And if I can use that to keep pushing the story of the band, the progressive reformers end up using the band as a tool to kind of try to keep kids off the street. And they have all this free time that they need to put positive energy into. Why not get them to play in a band?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So there's this shift then from what I mentioned before as this focus on music appreciation to all of a sudden in the 1910s, there is this kind of resurgence of, or this new surgence of music education organizations like the Music Supervisors National Conference, which was founded in 1907, which later became the Music Educators National Conference and is now today known as NAFME, or the National Association for Music Education, that founds itself on teaching students good music, but then starts to specifically advocate for the performance of good music. And so what's interesting to me about that is we have this, in an age when there are all these concerns about the mechanical reproduction technologies like the radio doing away with amateur performance opportunities, we have this new avenue all of a sudden specifically designed for amateur performance in school music. And that's really kind of the impetus to getting the band started in the public schools.
Mm-hmm. So now that I've always understood the school band movement as beginning in the Chicago area of Illinois.
Yeah, it's hard to say really where it began, but the Midwest was certainly an epicenter of it.
Mm-hmm. So now we talk about the institutionalization of the band. Mm-hmm. And the forces behind it, the cultural forces behind it. But was it organized at first, or did it just sort of happen in these, you just use a great word, epicenters, and then sort of spread from there?
I want to say it's more the latter, with kind of more localized factions that were doing concerted things, if that makes sense. So you have music education organizations on the one hand, like the Music Supervisors National Conference that I just mentioned, that are making a push for performance of good music. And specifically, there's this new adoption of group instrumental music instruction in the classroom, which kind of paves the way for being able to teach a group of instrumentalists. At the same time, you have other reform organizations that are thinking, hey, let's help education organizations with their efforts by kind of promoting music at a more general national level, instituting what were known as National Music Weeks to promote just music appreciation and participation in music. And then once this gets going, you have concerted efforts on the part of band instrument manufacturers who pick that up and say, well, now that this is a thing, let's try to make money off of it and really push advertising dollars into school bands. There's this whole faction of competitions that start in the 1920s, and there's a push towards those. So there's really several different concerted efforts coming from a lot of different directions that kind of build up the band in a kind of general institutionalizing way.
So when we're talking about this era and the beginning of the school band, was this based mostly on sort of like the Sousa band model, or did it come more from the marching band and the development of that? I guess I'm kind of want to see that connection.
Yeah, that's also an interesting question, because the band meant both things at the time. There were bands that really played concert music and marched, and because Sousa's band was so connected to the military, because Sousa was the leader of the U.S. Marine Band for so long, the militaristic influences are kind of inseparable from the band at that time. And so from the images that I've parsed in a lot of the literature from the time, a lot of the bands that were trying to establish themselves as concert bands were marching as well. And you have these, I mentioned there were these school band competitions in the 1920s that really raised the status of the wind band, that did a lot of work to try to standardize things like repertoire and instrumentation. And marching was part of those contests too. So bands would perform the required literature at these contests, but then there'd be a marching component to it as well. And so there's kind of a push and pull between the two elements of the band to kind of shape its identity. But I would say that ultimately most of the standardization efforts and the real efforts at institutionalizing the band came from the concert side of things, where you have organizations like the MSNC and the American Bandmasters Association saying, okay, this is what a band instrumentation should look like. If you have 72 members of your band, you should have this many clarinets, this many cornets, etc. And then saying, okay, now that you have that standardized, this is the kind of literature that school bands should be playing. And interestingly enough, a lot of the committees that are set up to decide this kind of thing have a lot of the professional band leaders from the golden age of bands on them. So Sousa, Herbert L. Clark, Arthur Pryor all end up on these committees that are deciding what should be standard in the band. So really, it's probably the Sousa concert style of the band from the golden age that the school band was modeled on.
You know what I'm finding interesting is the parallels. And, I always think about things like competition and marching band. I always think about these as modern phenomena, but you're saying that they're tied to the very earliest roots of school band music.
Absolutely. So like I mentioned, I can fill this out a little bit more. In the 1920s, there was a series of national school band competitions. They started in 1923 and were actually originally conceived of as entertainment for the Music Industry's Chamber of Commerce conference in Chicago. And because that first contest was pretty successful, the Music Supervisors National Conference caught wind of it, thought it was interesting, and decided to work with Carl Greenleaf, who was the president of the Kahn Company at the time, to turn those into something that could be more educationally sound. And they continued into the 1930s and really are probably the most galvanizing factor in terms of raising the stature and the popularity of the school band, because all of a sudden students are interested in joining their school band so they can go compete in these contests and win. And so the contests become the kind of hotbed for standardization, because the MSNC starts to implement rules for the contest that say, if you're going to enter the band or enter this contest, you have to have this standard instrumentation and you have to play this repertoire. And that's really what gets the ball rolling across the industry. And I think that really taps into a vogue at the time for competitions across American society. And one of the chapters of my dissertation, I kind of want to argue that the vogue for music competitions is part and parcel with what you see with scholastic athletics in the 1920s, that a number of educational and reform organizations, just like with the band, tried to use athletics to get kids off the streets, to give them an outlet for their energies, to teach them discipline, because they were so interested in competition that they would kind of buy into the program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is fascinating. So now, what was the name of that competition that you mentioned in Chicago? What was the formal name of it?
It goes by a couple of different names, honestly. I usually refer to them as the National School Band Competitions. Sometimes you'll see them referred to as National and Regional School Band Tournaments. There was no kind of one official name, but they were, once the first one was over with, they were taken over by the MSNC and run by their Committee on Instrumental Affairs. And they really ended up morphing in the 1940s into the kind of more familiar festival structures that we're used to today, as competition kind of fell out of favor.
Yeah. I just talked to Joe Allison for another episode, the one before you. And he was talking about how competitions in some states have become so formal that they're being used for teacher evaluations now.
Wow, really? Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So it's interesting, the evolution of this, or maybe we're coming full circle in a way. Yeah. I want to talk about Chicago.
Okay.
It's interesting to me that this starts in Chicago, and, Midwest is coming. Why Chicago?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Chicago was kind of a hotbed for musical progressivism, or the efforts to push progressive reforms through music organizations. There's a couple of books out there, and one in particular that talks about Chicago as a hotbed of musical progressive reform. And so I think that, in conjunction with the fact that all of the major band instrument manufacturers are in and around the Midwest, with Chicago being the major metropolitan area, there's just a lot of conditions that are ripe for allowing music generally, and the band specifically, to thrive in that area. And then, of course, Chicago plays a role in how popular jazz got. Chicago just has a deep, important musical history that contributed to a lot of different areas.
What other areas were hotbeds for school band music?
So certainly Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio, where other band instrument manufacturers were. If you look at the rosters of the national contest, you see a lot of bands coming from California, some from New England, from the Boston area, some down in Texas. But really, the South doesn't show up as much from what I've seen in my research at this time. And I'm not really sure how the kind of spread happens after the kind of birth of the what we call the school band movement. But it certainly makes its way down there in a couple of different forms.
Yeah, sure. And certainly speculate on that a little bit, but I'm interested in Texas. When did Texas make its ascendance?
Oh boy, I really don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I'm curious. These are interesting side questions that.
Yeah, I have a hunch, and this is very speculative, but I have a hunch that the popularization of the marching band as a part of collegiate athletics has played a large role in spreading bands throughout the South. And there's another series of histories to be written about the marching band tradition in the HBCU world, the historically Black colleges and universities, which have their own incredible marching band culture that it just flourishes with a kind of different style of marching band than the core style marching band that's more common on the West Coast or in the northern states.
Yeah, it's interesting. I taught for a year at Florida A&M.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I knew some of that.
Yeah.
It is interesting. I think in the South, I think you're absolutely right, because the dominance of college football, especially in the South, Texas and Alabama and places like that, Georgia, North Florida. I mean, we know the centers in the South for college football. So I think your speculation is probably pretty accurate.
Hopefully there are people that can write these histories, because there's so much that we still don't know all the real details about in terms of of band history.
Yeah, maybe I can get a listener to chime in too if someone out there
Absolutely,
knows.
that'd be great.
So I'm curious, what have I missed? What haven't I asked?
Well, we've covered a lot of it kind of in a cursory way. But one thing I do want to bring up is some more details about the role of the manufacturing industry in all of this. Like I mentioned, once the competitions got off the ground, that was kind of the catalyst for driving the band's popularity in the schools. And that's really when you see musical instrument manufacturers catch on to this new trend and throw themselves part and parcel into it. And the interesting thing is that you end up seeing a lot of interesting ways that instrument makers were doing this. The most interesting of which is probably the fact that most of the major band instrument manufacturers at the time, and we're talking about companies like Kahn, Holton, Bisher, King, York, companies like that, employ traveling salesmen or sales representatives in dealerships to go out into smaller towns across the country with the express purpose of starting school bands. And there's this proliferation of literature that's published by these manufacturers with details on how you can start your own school band. So, the 10 steps to starting your own school band so that you too can participate in these contests that are sweeping America. And they go so far as to actually offer guarantee plans. Holton, for example, goes so far as to say, we will guarantee that if you follow our plan, you will have a playing band in X number of days, or we'll return all the instruments with your money back. And so you literally have the kind of work that was being done by the Music Man, the things that in our popular imagination is represented by the Music Man, where traveling salesmen are trying to get bands started across the country so that they can sell more instruments, which I think is fascinating that it was that was something that was actually going on. And really, I think, contributed to why the Midwest ended up being an epicenter for bands, because they were localized to the manufacturing industry that was really pushing school bands. And then it was a way of the manufacturers kind of utilized the message that was being put out by reformers and educators. All of the language that was saying, join the school band to stay off the streets or to learn better discipline. The manufacturers are saying the exact same things to convince them of the worth of buying a band instrument and playing in a band.
I want to ask about literature.
Yeah.
So with band literature in these early contests, what were they playing? Were they still playing transcriptions?
They were playing a lot of transcriptions. So this goes a little bit back to your earlier question. I do think there was a concerted effort to kind of transpose the literature of the professional bands to this new market of the school band, with the added caveat that they were doing it with the express purpose of teaching these kids, quote unquote, good music. So they were trying to have them play music that was considered worthy of studying. So there were a lot of transcriptions of European art music, mostly of the 19th century, really. A lot of Wagner, maybe the 18th and 19th century. A lot of Wagner, a lot of Beethoven, some Bach even, which is going back even earlier, but a lot of symphonic works that would have been popular at the time. But then, and so that might be expected because that's the kind of canon that was being formed with the symphony orchestra around the time. But what's interesting is that that's supplemented then by this kind of newly canonized body of music of original works for band that had been popularized during the golden age of bands. So a lot of Sousa marches show up in the required literature of the contests because they're kind of a new portion of this new band canon that they think band students should be learning to play. Part of that, of course, is that Sousa was contributing to the standardization efforts and probably had some interest in getting his works on there as well. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of the overall picture of the literature that they were at least trying to get students to play. I would venture to say they were also playing popular tunes on top of that, but they weren't officially sanctioned by the MSNC.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure there were arrangements. So now, companies like C.L. Barnhouse or Carl Fischer,
Mm-hmm.
they represented composers like Carl King and John Philip Sousa. What was their role in the establishment of these contests, and when did they sort of begin to flex their muscles in the process?
Yeah. So I will admit that this is one chapter that I still have some research yet to do. So my picture of the publishing industry's role into all of this is still a little bit hazier. But because, as I mentioned, there was a lot of representation of orchestral transcriptions in the kind of newly forming band canon, the publishing industry had just as much of a stake in the success of the school band industry as band instrument manufacturers did. And what you end up seeing is a kind of new wave of transcriptions being done, especially in the 1930s, as the band has really kind of come into its own as an institution and is now taking strides at self-sustainment. And a lot of the what we think of today as being cornerstones of the transcription repertoire come from around that time, the 1930s and going into the 1940s, which is a little after my dissertation ends. But the transcriptions that Laurendo does, for example, of the Bizet-Laurisienne suite is done in the 1920s and becomes pretty standard for a while. The Lucien Caillé arrangements that I probably still get played are done, I think, in the 1930s, and then in the 1940s.
I just saw one of those actually just the other day.
Which one was it? Do you remember?
I don't remember, but I just ran across one. Yeah.
I remember when I first started working on my dissertation and was having conversations with my advisor, he brought up a lot of these that he used to play, like the Elsa's Procession to the Cathedral, that's so famous. And one of his questions was, where did these kind of cornerstone transcriptions come into play? And my at least initial thoughts are that they're part of efforts to kind of renew the transcriptions for this new institution of the school band.
All right, I'm going to push you a little bit here and ask you one more question about this.
Great.
So now, what kind of role do you think circus bands and touring bands, like say the Goldman Band, had on the movement?
Yeah, that's also interesting. Circus bands I know a little bit less about, but touring bands were standard parts of the kind of role of the professional bands in the golden age, right? They would travel around and have real high profile performances around the country and around the world eventually. So they did a ton of work in terms of promoting the band as a venue for popular music. They did a ton for promoting amateur music making. If you go and see one of these bands that comes into town and it makes an impact on you, you're probably more likely to want to pick up an instrument yourself and try it out. And then, of course, the kind of circus band music does work its way into the repertoire. I'd have to go back and check, but I remember Carl King marches showing up at least a couple of times in the repertoire that I've looked at for the national contests. So they're all kind of part of the disparate tapestry of the band in America at this time that existed in so many different places and in different formats. But still, we kind of try and think of as one entity of the band.
I find that fascinating. I don't have to find someone who knows the connection, because it seems like the band composer, that this churn that we have now, one of the things about the band world is that there's so much new music being written every year. Mm-hmm. It seems like that really begins in the 1950s and 1960s. Yeah,
and there's this whole, this all falls kind of after the date range of my dissertation, but there's this whole renewed push with, for example, Frederick Fennell's efforts with the Eastman Wind Ensemble to kind of raise the artistic stature of the wind band. And there's this new idea of the wind ensemble, of the wind band as chamber music or as high art, and this new push to get new works written specifically for the wind band, so they don't have to rely on transcriptions and can kind of try to stand on their own feet as an artistic organization. So, and I think you're right. The band does probably better than a lot of musical organizations in the country, or musical kind of worlds in promoting new music, and commissioning new works and continuing to have those new works performed instead of having them commissioned and then kind of fall out of performance.
Yeah, now it has its both the pluses and the minuses. The one thing about it is that there's this vibrancy of new music in the band world. The other hand, sometimes there's too much music, and so you take your good with your bad. Yeah. So I'm curious then. So when did the institutionalized band come off of the football field at the university level? When did music departments and music programs begin to embrace the concert band and that as opposed to just sort of the more classical concert ensembles?
Yeah, that's interesting. I really think that the public school band was the driving force behind.
Yeah,
I agree.
This. I agree.
You have the stories of some of the universities that were on the vanguard, like Harding's band, for example, that were doing things with bands at the university level that no one else was doing at the time. But all of the effort into creating a space for the concert band as an educational vehicle is done at the public school level and then kind of filters into the college from that point. Because at the time, most of, when marching bands start to show up at collegiate athletic events, they're kind of ad hoc ragtag ensembles that show up to play some fight songs and stuff.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Oh yeah. If you look at kind of the birth of college football in the United States, a lot of it happens in the Ivy League. I think the first ever recognized football game was between Princeton and Rutgers.
I think you might be right.
Yeah. And then Harvard and Yale obviously are important here. And this is where you start to see the first things that some people like to refer to as marching bands. Mm-hmm. But they really are just kind of ragtag ensembles that play some fight songs. That, of course, is the football side of things. There's also the marching that's done by military bands.
Yep.
That is kind of a different thing. And then university bands like Harding's try to combine the two and make these big militaristic marching bands that play at athletic events. But as the public school band gets to be popular and students are trained in the band in their schools, that all of a sudden provides this new wealth of trained instrumentalists that go to college and can then participate in their own college bands. So I really think the university followed the lead of the public school in the 20s and 30s. And then in the 40s and 50s, the wind ensemble model kind of took over.
Yeah, someday there's going to be someone listening to this episode from the Stanford band, and they're going to be like, "Yes,
yeah,"
because they're the original model.
Indeed. What's funny too is that the Yale and the Harvard bands are still that kind of ragtag model too. They don't ascribe to the core style of marching, but they don't do it on nearly the scale that the Stanford band does.
Yeah, my brother-in-law was in the Princeton Band.
Okay, so you've probably seen it.
Yeah, I guess, it's interesting because Andy Pease, I want to be correct that it was Andy. He was, I think he was at Dartmouth, and he was all student-led. He conducted the concert band.
I believe that.
Yeah, so it seems like there's a tradition in the Ivy Leagues of that sort of student-led organization.
Yep, I think so.
Interesting. Another thing to think about.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Harding's band a few times. You want to give the listeners a clue?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it was the University of Illinois, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. So Austin Harding, Albert Austin Harding, was this celebrated figure who many have credited with kind of starting the university band as is familiar to us today at the University of Illinois, where he kind of built up this band program into a kind of large professionalized ensemble that marched and that played concert music and really tried to raise the stature of the band at an educational institution.
Yeah, and Illinois is a proud tradition of only having a few band directors.
Yeah.
Because Harding was the band director there for 41 years, and then Mark Hensley.
Oh, you mean the university specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right about that, yeah.
It's incredible, actually. They've had, 4 or 5?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so this has been really, really interesting. We've gone quite a while, but I have a few more questions for you if you're game for it.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so let's close this out with my normal battery of questions, just so I place you with everyone else who's on the show. So what's the last work you'd want to perform for wind ensemble? If you had one last concert to play.
That is a difficult question. Do I get to choose work for wind ensemble or for band, or could I choose for chamber winds?
Anything you want, whatever you want.
Okay.
I've had people choose orchestra works too.
A lot of the musical experiences that I've had that have been most dear to me and most important to me have been with brass quintet. I played with a brass quintet in college that probably had more impact on my development as a performer and as a musician than most anything that I did in college. And so there are a number of works that I played with my college brass quintet that had particular meaning to me. But I think if I had to choose one last one to play, it would probably be the Ingolf Dahl's Music for Six Brass Instruments, just because of the personal history I have with the piece and how fun it is to play and how great it is.
How about for the wind ensemble?
For the wind ensemble, I would either go with Alfred Reed's Armenian Dances Suite, which I played a lot in high school, and it reminds me of my dad. Or I'd choose the first piece that I ever played in my college wind ensemble, which was David Maslanka's A Child's Garden of Dreams, which I also have some special connections to.
Yeah, well, David Maslanka comes up a lot in this podcast.
I bet he does, yeah.
It's so funny. I think about one of my most influential pieces was my first college piece, or at least the first one that I remember being like, oh, I'm in college now.
Yeah.
And that was Nellie Bell's Tritico.
Oh, yeah. I never performed it. I remember actually hearing the college wind ensemble that I later joined. I remember hearing them play that when I was in high school at one of their festivals. Yeah,
I did Festivo in high school, but then Tritico was a whole different kind of beast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, great. So what advice, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead there. So what do you think, knowing about what you know about the history of the wind band, what challenges are we facing in the 21st century? And is there anything we can draw from our past to meet those challenges?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I have a lot of ways I could answer this. But the first one I think that I'd like to bring up is that there's a real preoccupation these days that I see, especially in higher education, but around discourses around education generally, a preoccupation with job preparation. And there's a focus from that on STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, as well as business, that overlooks the value of the arts and of the humanities in educational programs. And I think this does a disservice in a number of ways. One, because the arts and the humanities do, in fact, provide valuable job training. You know, they teach the ability to think critically, they teach writing skills, the ability to think across history and across disciplines, all kinds of things that employers look for in a variety of jobs. But I think even more important than that, the arts and the humanities have intrinsic value that we shouldn't tie necessarily to job preparation. And I think there are reasons that we as human beings should study the arts and the humanities just to make ourselves better people and to enrich our societies and our cultures and to enrich our lives. And I think doing away with the arts and the humanities just because they don't have the same kind of direct applicability to finding a career as maybe a business degree does is a real shame. And so I think there are ways that we can, as music educators, try to work against that kind of idea. You know, it starts even at the smallest level. For me, like, I just don't make jokes anymore about how I got a music history degree, so that's why I'm going to work at Starbucks or something, because I think that does a disservice to the real valuable training that humanities degrees can give. And then on the kind of more ambitious scale, it's important to, be vocal with administrations, with political leaders to make sure that they know the value of these programs for our students and for our society.
Yeah, I can't agree more with that. I just can't. So if you, I'll say that I talked about this recently with Aaron Given, who was a guest on episode 30, and he also brought this up. And I think it's so important that we don't lose sight of the fact that music is valuable just because it's valuable.
Exactly.
I know, and I mentioned this in that episode, I believe. I know that we need to advocate and we need to give evidence, and that helps some people change their minds. But at the end of the day, it's because it's an art. And the world without music would not be the world, or would not be life.
Yeah.
Anyway, preaching to the choir.
Right.
Sorry.
Exactly. And if there's one thing I could add to that, in the work that I've done for my dissertation, one thing that I was surprised to see is that music educators have been employing the same rhetoric around reasons why students should study music for 100, 150 years now. It's remarkable looking at papers that are delivered at the Music Supervisors National Conference meetings in 1910 saying, we should teach our kids music because it will make them better at math. It will make them better at this. It will make them, giving all these reasons to satisfy the requirements of politics or the administration. And one thing that I think my dissertation can shed light on is that those reasons have histories. They have specific reasons for being employed, and it might be worthwhile to understand how educators have had to kind of beg for the livelihood of the discipline historically, so that we know best how to approach it now.
Wow. Yeah, the more things change, the more they say stay.
It's really remarkable, yeah.
God, I can't even get that out.
Yeah.
All right. So what advice would you give to your 20-year-old self, your younger self? And I know you're still in school, but...
Indeed. And there's certainly a lot of advice I could still take. But the one thing that I do think I would try to impress on myself when I was in college, let's say, was to internalize the fact that the perception that I had of the quality of my work, whether that was my academic work or my playing, should not be a reflection on my worth as a person, if that makes sense. I went through a phase when I was in college when I was particularly frustrated with my trumpet playing, and I let it get to me in terms of my own feelings of self-worth. And I think that did a lot of damage to some of my personal relationships. It did damage in terms of my ability to fix whatever problems I thought I had on the trumpet. And I've found now, as I'm working as an academic, that the more I can realize that my work self is separate from my personal self, the more I can work to improve both of those selves in the most efficient way possible.
Yeah, that's really wise advice. Okay, so I'm going to ask you about book recommendations. It's not something I normally ask my guests, but you're a musicologist and you're presenting research. So are there any books or resources that people can go and get some more information? Yeah,
I think I had two that I thought were particularly germane to the conversation we had today. The first one is a book by a researcher at the University of Maryland in College Park. His name is Patrick Warfield. I don't know if you've run across his work before, but he
sounds familiar.
Yeah, he does a lot of work on Sousa specifically and on the kind of golden age of bands more generally. He wrote a book in, I think, 2013 called Making the March King, which is just a fantastic treatment of Sousa's years in Washington. And he kind of addresses a lot of the myth making that goes into turning Sousa into the kind of figurehead of the band that he became. And then the second one is a book that just came out in 2017. It's an edited volume of a collection of essays that's called Women's Bands in America, Performing Music and Gender. And that was edited by Jill Sullivan, who works at ASU, I think. And it's a series of essays that detail women's contributions to the band world, which I think is a sorely, sorely underrepresented part of scholarship on the band. And one thing that we didn't get to talk about as much today is the kind of gender dynamics that were at play in the school band. But it's full of essays that detail women's contributions to the band from the professional sphere all the way down to to public education.
Mm-hmm. Joshua, we're at the end of the interview here, but that's I've had this conversation with a few of my guests. Can you just briefly touch on that idea of the gender? Because I know that we still have a long way to go in 2017 with this.
Absolutely. So I'll just touch on the part of it that intersects with the school band sphere, although we could talk about it in a lot of different ways. But the efforts to utilize the school band as a tool for progressive reform they were efforts that were aimed explicitly and particularly at boys. There was this idea around the turn of the 20th century that music was somehow a quote unquote feminized profession, that playing music somehow made you less of a man, or made you a sissy or something like that. It drew on a very specific idea of what masculinity was at the time in America. And so progressive reformers took aim at boys with the band because they could convince them that playing in the band was masculine enough that it was okay for them to play music, because the band was noisy, because the band was militaristic, because the instruments were big, that made it okay for them to play in the band. The byproduct of that, however, was that it made it more difficult for girls to make their way into the band, because the band was thought of as a masculine sphere. It was a masculine organization. And so you do have girls' bands, segregated gendered bands that were performing in the 1920s. And as you go into the 30s, they start to become integrated and girls do play in the bands. But we still see effects of stereotyped ideas of what instruments are appropriate for which genders that still govern the way that students choose instruments today. And that's probably the most evident in this time period, even in terms of in the 1910s, 1920s, who got to be band leaders. In a world, education as a larger field in the late 19th century and going into the 20th century, a lot of teachers were women because it was a traditionally feminine role, I guess, to educate children. One of the major exceptions to that were music supervisors, because music supervisors were expected to direct the band, and to direct the band, you had to be able to play all the instruments, and women traditionally weren't as likely to play all certain brass instruments or other band instruments. And so it was, for most of the 20th century, being a band leader was just it was much harder to succeed as a woman. And so I think that these kind of elements that fed the development of the band in the schools are still persistent today, and we still have to kind of continue to work to counteract them and to promote women in the band world as musicians, or as performers, as conductors, as administrators. It's I think a really important thing that we all need to work towards.
Wow, that's fascinating. Boy, we could do a whole episode on that.
It's so interesting. There's so much here that I think is just so interesting and continues to have impacts on us today.
Yeah. So while we're talking about this, how can people get in touch with you?
Email is the best. Email is just joshua.gailey@yale.edu.
All right. And is there, knowing that we're the end of October 2017, and this may be on the internet for a long time, is there anything coming up that you'd like to promote?
So the most immediate thing, like Michael O'Connor, actually, I'll be giving a paper at the annual meeting of the Society for American Music in Kansas City in the beginning of March. I'm actually on his panel. He's giving the first paper, and I'll be the third paper on that panel. But apart from that, I am working on this dissertation, which is not done yet, but I'm hoping will be done by the end of 2019, or the spring of 2019, I guess. So that's the kind of immediate thing on my horizon, and then we'll see what comes after that.
Okay, so this was great. Thanks so much, Joshua.
Hey, thank you, Mark. This was really great. I enjoyed it very much.
Thanks so much.
Yep, thank you.